Just a nurse. That's what they whispered when Rachel Torres walked past the blood bank, when she passed the orthopedic wing, when she clocked in at Cedar Creek Medical in Norfolk wearing scrubs 3 sizes too big that hung off her frame like borrowed skin. Just a temp. Just a body to fill gaps during night shift, to push meds and empty bedpans and stay invisible. They didn't know that her fingers moved in automatic rhythm as she walked, 2-second intervals, checking pulse points on every patient she passed, radial, carotid, femoral, muscle memory from a place where you learn to triage under fire or people died. They didn't know the faded 75th Regiment patch sewn inside her jacket lining in the staff locker matched patches on uniforms hanging in rooms she hadn't entered yet. They didn't know that her daughter's crayon drawing sat behind that patch, a stick-figure soldier with yellow hair and the words "Mommy works far away" in red marker. The fluorescent lights above hummed their sickly electric song as Rachel pushed a med cart down the linoleum corridor that smelled of antiseptic and something else underneath, fear, maybe, or the particular resignation of a place where people came to be fixed or to break. Her left side was a half-second slower than it should have been, a compensated limp that barely registered unless you were trained to notice. Most people weren't. She checked in at the blood donor registry on her tablet, scrolling through her own name. For donations in 6 months. O-negative universal donor. One of those donations marked directed, for the Army Ranger in room 312, recovery phase, post-operative trauma. The night shift coordinator barely glanced up from her desk, didn't even make eye contact when assigning Rachel to the trauma wing. The assignment nobody wanted. The floor with the highest acuity patients, the fastest turnover, the staff who'd already heard the rumors about Rachel and had already decided she was the weak link, the one who'd slow them down, the one who missed things. Cedar Creek had a way of eating people like that. Rachel tied her ID badge around her neck, credential photo from 2 weeks ago, hair pulled back so tight it stretched the skin at her temples, expression flat enough to stop a truck. The badge clattered against her sternum as she moved, a small metallic sound she'd learned not to flinch at. Sounds meant information. Footsteps on tile meant the attending was making rounds. Ventilators meant someone was critically unstable. The squeak of a stretcher meant incoming trauma. She'd learned to listen like a language, in a place where listening meant the difference between saving someone and watching them code. Room 312 was at the end of the east corridor, past the nurse station where 2 RNs were charting, past the supply closet where someone had left the door cracked open, past the windows that faced the parking lot where the first light of early morning was just beginning to crack the dark sky open. Inside, the Army Ranger lay in the raised hospital bed, his uniform hanging in the closet on a wooden hanger. Desert tan dress uniform. The kind you wore to formal occasions, or wore to keep the last piece of yourself civilian when everything else had been stripped away. His injuries were visible even under the sheets, tension in his shoulders that spoke of pain management, the particular stillness of someone who'd learned to move economically to avoid triggering damage deeper inside. Rachel's eyes caught on the unit patch on his dress uniform jacket. 75th Regiment. Faded, worn, the kind of patch that had seen wear in climates where dust worked itself into every fiber. The same regiment. The same place she'd been before the Army had decided she needed to disappear, before a classified operation in 2019 had gone sideways in ways she still couldn't talk about, before the Pentagon had looked her in the eye and told her Captain Rachel Torres was officially dead, training accident, Fort Benning, terribly tragic, never happened. Her breathing stayed level. Her hand stayed steady as she checked his full line, ran her fingers along the catheter site, logged the fluid levels in the chart. The Ranger's eyes opened slightly, watching her with the particular awareness of someone who recognized competence when he saw it. She didn't meet his gaze. Eye contact was a liability. His mother sat in the visitor's chair next to the bed, a woman in her 60s with dyed blonde hair and the kind of rigid posture that came from years of holding yourself together through deployments and operations you couldn't ask about. She watched Rachel work with the careful scrutiny of someone trying to decide if this person was trustworthy around someone you'd already nearly lost. The monitors beeped their regular rhythm, steady, good, the sinus rhythm of a healing body. Rachel documented the observation and turned to leave, her movements efficient, her presence small enough that people forgot she was in the room the moment she stepped out. That's when the mother spoke. Her voice was careful, The way mothers learned to be careful when they were asking for things in places where people held your child's life in their hands. Is there someone more experienced who could handle his care? Rachel was halfway to the door. She didn't turn around. The words landed somewhere that was still part of her, some piece that hadn't been cauterized by the transition into this life of borrowed scrubs and borrowed names and borrowed time. She felt the ranger's eyes on her back, felt the mother's anxiety like a physical weight, felt the particular quality of a room that had just shifted into a space where one person was found inadequate in front of everyone who mattered. That was when Dr. Pierce arrived. His shoes clicked against the tile before she saw him, leather Italian loafers that probably cost more than Rachel made in a week, clicking with the precision of someone who used sound as a tool, who wanted people to know he was coming before he arrived. Dr. Pierce was tall, mid-50s, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of jaw that had spent its whole life being told it was handsome. His eyes moved past Rachel without registering her presence and landed on the ranger's mother with the particular attention of someone who understood that satisfied families didn't file complaints. "Of course," he said, his voice smooth as oil on still water. "Rachel, we'll have one of the senior nurses take this case. Your time would be better spent on the post-op recoveries in 305 and 310. It wasn't a request. It was the particular violence of a man who didn't need to raise his voice because his position was loud enough. Rachel's jaw clenched once, barely perceptible, just the muscles tightening for a half-second before releasing. She'd learned to hide that kind of thing. She'd learned to hide a lot of things. She nodded without speaking and returned to her logbook, continuing the notation she'd been making before the ranger's mother spoke, before Dr. Pierce arrived, before the world shifted again in ways that felt increasingly familiar. Dr. Pierce watched her from across the room. He was trying to read something in her expression, looking for some sign of resentment or defensiveness or the kind of emotional reaction that would confirm his hypothesis about her, that she was weak, that she was unreliable, that she was exactly the kind of person you could safely discard without consequence. What he saw was nothing. Rachel's face was a blank page. Her hands continued writing in the chart with steady strokes. Her breathing remained level. She didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She simply continued working, as if he hadn't spoken, as if she hadn't just been publicly reassigned, as if the particular humiliation of being deemed unfit in front of a patient and his family was the kind of thing that happened to her regularly enough that it no longer registered as significant. What Dr. Pierce didn't know was that Rachel had recognized the patch on that uniform, had seen in the ranger's eyes the particular awareness of someone who knew what 75th Regiment meant, who understood the classification level of operations that took place in Helmand Province, who probably knew that the woman standing in his room wearing borrowed scrubs and a blank expression had done things in that exact province that had cost her everything she'd built. What he didn't know was that her daughter's drawing sat in her locker, tucked behind that faded 75th Regiment patch, waiting for a day when Rachel could explain why Mommy worked so far away, why Mommy never talked about the years between the drawing and now, why Mommy kept a plasma cutter in the garage even though they lived in an apartment, why Mommy sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning doing tactical breathing until the nightmares retreated enough to let her sleep again. Rachel finished her notation and stepped out of room 312, moving past the nurse station where the 2 RNs were already looking for her, ready to redirect her toward the other rooms, toward the patients nobody else wanted, toward the particular corner of Cedar Creek Medical where people like Rachel were meant to remain invisible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd seen it coming. The worst part was that this was the 4th assignment she'd been reassigned from in 6 weeks, the 4th time someone had requested someone more experienced, someone more qualified, someone who wasn't Rachel. The worst part was that she understood exactly what was happening and exactly why, and that understanding was a weight that sat on her chest like a stone she'd have to carry through an 8-hour shift with her hand steady and her face blank and her daughter's drawing waiting in a locker that Dr. Pierce would never see. The unit board was laminated white plastic, patient names written in blue marker that never fully erased, and Dr. Pierce stopped Rachel at its edge while she was updating vitals from room 308, her handwriting precise and clinical. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric whine overhead, and the nurse station had exactly 4 people within earshot when his voice cut across the space like a surgical blade. "Miss Torres. Care to explain this?" He held up the chart from her previous shift, his fingers gripping it at the corner as though the paper itself might be contaminated. Rachel turned slowly, her movements economical, a person accustomed to being interrupted. Her jaw was a clean line, expressionless as a closed door. The charting is complete, Dr. Pierce. All vitals documented. Timestamps for each entry. He flipped through the pages, scanning, his eyes narrowing in that particular way that said he was looking for a reason rather than looking for information. Your narrative notes from 2300 hours. They are sparse. We need fuller documentation here at Cedar Creek. This isn't some clinic, standards exist for a reason. Rachel stepped closer to the board, her voice dropping into that register that carried without needing volume. The notes match protocol. Vital signs, assessment, interventions. Everything required. Legible isn't the same as thorough, Dr. Pierce said, and now 2 of the 4 nurses were watching, the way people watch car accidents in slow motion. His voice took on a theatrical quality, designed to travel. Maybe temp agencies have different standards. But we don't. Redo it. And take more time with your penmanship. He extended the chart toward her, his smile carrying the weight of a threat. I'd hate to see you stumble out of your first week here. Rachel accepted the clipboard with both hands, the gesture almost ceremonial. Her jaw clenched once, so subtle that only someone trained in reading human micro-expressions would have caught it, then released. She didn't apologize. Didn't defend herself. Didn't do anything but nod once, a shallow dip of her chin, and move to the corner desk to begin rewriting identical information in even more painstaking script, her pen moving with the methodical precision of someone transcribing sacred text. The nurses returned to their work. The moment passed. But something had shifted in the air, the way pressure changes before a storm. Room 312 was 3 doors down, and the ranger's mother was sitting rigid-backed in the chair beside his bed when Rachel entered to take his blood pressure, her equipment bag hanging from her shoulder like a soldier's pack. The woman looked up from her son's sleeping face, handsome, young, the kind of young that made the Iraq and Afghanistan wars feel suddenly real instead of distant, and something crossed her expression when she registered Rachel. Not recognition. Calculation. Excuse me, are you the nurse who was here before? The question came out wrapped in careful courtesy, the sort used by people accustomed to getting what they wanted. Yes. I'm Rachel. I'll be checking his vitals and... Is there someone more experienced available? The words came faster now, rehearsed, the way people speak when they've already made their decision. He's been through so much, and I'd feel more comfortable if someone with more background handled his care. Before Rachel could respond, before she could even draw breath, Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway as though summoned by some mechanism she hadn't understood was in place. He wore his white coat like armor, and his smile was the smile of a man who had orchestrated this moment down to the second. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. I completely understand. His voice dripped honey, the kind of solicitousness he never extended to staff. I'll reassign someone immediately. Torres, you're needed in discharge paperwork. Right now. Rachel stood there with the blood pressure cuff still in her hands, the rubber tubing coiled like a snake, and she felt the weight of 3 people watching her, the mother with relief flooding her face, the ranger still sleeping, Dr. Pierce with his eyes glittering like a predator that had just made a kill. Her hands remained steady. Her face showed nothing. She set the equipment down on the bedside table with deliberate care, each movement controlled, the way a person moves when they're conscious of being observed. Of course, Dr. Pierce, she said quietly, and walked out. The break room was at the end of the west corridor, a space that smelled like old coffee and the ghost of 1,000 sad lunches. Rachel sat in the corner at 11:22 a.m. with her brown paper bag, the kind that said she packed her own meals, the kind that nobody commented on anymore because it was simply what she did. The room was empty when she entered. She removed her sandwich methodically, turkey, no mayo, on whole wheat, and set it on the laminate table. 30 seconds later, a nurse named Devon looked up from her phone call. Oh, I forgot, I need to call cardiac about Mrs. Chen. She was out the door. A second nurse stood abruptly, rounding early today. Catch you later. A third checked her watch, breaks over anyway. Meetings. The fourth, a woman named Sophie who sometimes made eye contact, hesitated in the doorway, her expression caught somewhere between pity and self-preservation, then disappeared down the hallway. Rachel sat alone under the fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects in a jar. The break room table was scratched white laminate, the chairs were plastic, and the window faced the hospital's east parking lot. She ate her sandwich methodically, chewing each bite the number of times she'd been trained to chew in mess halls where you ate fast because you never knew how long you'd stay at the table. But this wasn't a mess hall. This was a place where a dozen people worked within shouting distance and had decided, collectively, that one person was invisible. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound besides her own breathing. By early afternoon, Dr. Pierce called her to the unit board where the day shift staff was clustered around charting stations, and he posted a written reprimand in a manila folder, his signature flourishing across the bottom in blue ink like a signature on an execution order. The words used were precise: failure to follow documentation protocol. Requires remediation and ongoing supervision. 3 strikes policy here, Miss Torres, he said, loud enough that everyone could hear. You're at 2 now. I'd suggest you take this seriously. Rachel read it without touching the paper, her eyes moving across the text with the same efficiency they'd used to scan a medical chart. Then she walked back to her logbook and began updating the notes from her current patients, her pen moving in its characteristic small, efficient script, as if Dr. Pierce existed in a different dimension and his words had arrived from somewhere she didn't need to acknowledge. But the weight was gathering now, accumulating like water behind a dam, and by the time her shift ended at 10 p.m., something in her chest had started to crack. She drove home in the darkness, the Norfolk streets empty at that hour, the kind of empty that felt personal. Her apartment was on Fairfax Avenue, a 2-bedroom with a second-hand couch and walls she hadn't bothered to paint because they weren't hers and would never be hers. Her daughter was asleep, had been asleep for hours, and Rachel should have gone to bed. Should have showered first, should have removed her scrubs and placed them in the wash and moved through the evening routines of people who had homes instead of quarters they were occupying temporarily. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table at 10:43 p.m. with her work bag still on her shoulder, and she put her head down on the cold formica surface, and her shoulders started to shake in that particular way that bodies shake when something inside them has finally reached its limit. That was how Emma found her. Small Emma, 7-year-old Emma with her father's eyes and her mother's jawline, padding out of the bedroom in her dinosaur pajamas at 11:04 p.m. because she'd heard the sound of a car door and assumed her mother wouldn't be home for hours yet. Mommy. The word was small, confused, the way children ask questions when reality has deviated from their understanding of how the world should work. Rachel lifted her head. Her face was wet. She wiped it with the back of her hand, a gesture so quickly executed it might not have been there at all, and then she turned to look at her daughter, and the composure that had held all day simply fractured. "Why are you home early?" Emma's voice carried the weight of betrayed expectations. She'd done her homework, she'd eaten her dinner with the babysitter, she'd gone to bed on schedule because that was how things worked. Mommy came home late. Mommy came home tired. Mommy didn't come home early with tears on her face and something broken in her eyes. Rachel couldn't answer. The reasons were too complicated, too layered with classified history and military protocols she couldn't discuss and a rank she could never claim and a man who was systematically dismantling her credibility through methods so subtle and institutional that they looked like truth from a distance. "I'm just tired, baby," Rachel said finally, and the lie tasted like copper. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she understood exactly what was happening. She understood that Dr. Pierce had made phone calls, had orchestrated her removal from room 312, had begun the process of documenting a paper trail that would end with her gone from Cedar Creek Medical before her 3-month contract reached its end. The worst part was that she could predict every move he would make because this was a game she'd played before, not in hospitals, but in smaller quarters with higher stakes and people who wanted her disappeared. She'd been erased once already, officially dead at Fort Benning, her service record sealed, her name struck from the 75th Regiment's roster. She'd walked away from Captain Rachel Torres and become a woman named after a place in Texas, a woman who existed in the margins, a woman who worked temp shifts and kept her head down and let people like Dr. Pierce believe she was exactly what she appeared to be. But Emma didn't understand any of that. Emma only understood that her mother was crying at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, and that something had changed, and that the safe-ordered world of bedtimes and routines had fractured along some fault line Emma couldn't see. "Come back to bed with me?" Emma asked, and the small hope in her voice nearly broke Rachel completely. She stood, took her daughter's hand, small, warm, real, and together they walked back to the bedroom, where Rachel lay beside her until Emma's breathing evened into sleep, her small back curved against Rachel's chest, and Rachel stared at the ceiling in the darkness and understood that the next few days would determine everything. The call came at 2:11 a.m. The intercom crackled with urgency, code blue, ICU, room 312, and Rachel was already moving before the overhead finished speaking. She'd been charting at the nurse's station, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel suspended. 3 hours left on her final shift. 3 hours until she became invisible again. Room 312 was chaos held in place by protocol. The ranger lay motionless, his chest barely rising, his face the color of wet concrete. The resident stood frozen beside the ventilator, hands trembling slightly as he tried to remember his own training. The attending was on his way but wouldn't arrive for another 6 minutes. The monitor showed what everyone already knew: the pressure inside his chest was crushing his lungs. Attention pneumothorax. Air trapped where it shouldn't be, collapsing everything in its path. Rachel moved to the bedside. She didn't ask permission. She didn't defer to the resident's rank or the attending's incoming timeline. She assessed in one fluid glance, the patient's neck veins distended like rope, one side of his chest silent on auscultation, the other side gasping. The needle decompression was the only move that mattered. 14-gauge angiocath. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The procedure took 45 seconds when done right. It took death when done wrong. The resident started to speak. Rachel was already prepping the site, her fingers steady as a surgical laser, her movements precise enough to have been rehearsed 1,000 times. Because they had been. In a sandstorm in Helmand Province. With mortars incoming. With a Marine squad leader bleeding out from shrapnel that had punched through his ribs exactly like this, pressure building, lung collapsing, the kind of injury that took you in 60 seconds if no one moved fast enough. "I've got this," she said, and her voice was different now. Lower. Authoritative. Not a request but a statement of fact. The needle went in. Clean entry through skin and muscle and fascia. The hiss of air escaping, that distinctive sound like a tire deflating, like relief rushing out of a compressed space. The monitor responded immediately. The heart rate that had been racing at 148 beats per minute began to slow. The oxygen saturation that had been plummeting climbed upward. 78, 82, 88, 91. Climbing still. The ranger gasped. His lungs filled. His eyes flew open, panic giving way to the simple animal relief of being able to breathe again. Rachel secured a 16-gauge chest tube one-handed while keeping her other palm against his sternum, feeling his heartbeat come back under control beneath her touch. She'd done this 17 times in Helmand. She'd done it twice in her civilian life, both times in the darkness of the ER, both times saving lives that statistics said should have been over. The resident stared at her like she'd stepped out of a myth. The attending arrived 40 seconds later, assessed the situation in the way experienced physicians do, saw the tube, saw the improving numbers, saw everything already handled, and simply nodded. "Good work," he said to the resident, who had the decency to look ashamed and still managed to accept the compliment. Rachel was already cleaning up, already documenting, already becoming invisible again. But someone else had been watching. Dr. Pierce kept security footage running in the ICU. Insurance, he called it. Liability protection. What it actually was, what Rachel understood it to be, was oversight. Control. A way to see everything that happened when he wasn't there to manage it. He sat in his office at 3:13 a.m., rewinding the footage, watching Rachel move through those 45 seconds like a conductor through a symphony. No hesitation. No fumbling. No moment where she stopped to think. He watched her hands. He watched her spine stay perfectly straight when the resident faltered. He watched her make a medical decision that should have belonged to an attending physician, and he watched the attending validate that decision when he arrived too late to stop it. At 3:15 a.m., Dr. Pierce made his first call. The staffing agency that had hired Rachel out as temp labor picked up on the third ring, apologetic about the hour, suddenly attentive when Pierce began to speak. "I'm terminating the contract on Rachel Torres. Effective immediately. There are concerns about her credentials and her employment history. I'd recommend you conduct a full audit of her placement." The voice on the other end scrambled to agree, to apologize, to promise full compliance. Pierce hung up before they could finish. At 3:18 a.m., he made his second call. Administration answered because administration always answered when the chief of surgery called at any hour. "I need Rachel Torres's building access revoked. Credential irregularities. I'm recommending we don't process her paperwork for conversion to permanent staff." It wasn't a question. It was a command delivered with the smooth certainty of a man who'd never been refused anything. At 3:22 a.m., he made his third call. The medical board. A colleague he knew well enough to call at this hour. "I've encountered a nurse with significant gaps in her employment history. Background inconsistencies. I think it warrants a formal inquiry." The voice on the other end took careful notes. Promised investigation. Promised discretion. By 3:25 a.m., the network of his power had been activated. The pieces were in motion. Whatever Rachel Torres actually was, whoever she actually served, whatever skills she actually possessed, none of it would matter. She would be gone. Rachel didn't know any of this yet. She finished her documentation at 3:38 a.m. The Ranger was stable. The chest tube was draining properly. The attending had praised her work. For just a moment, standing in the hallway with the night shift flowing around her, she let herself believe that maybe she'd turn something around. Maybe Dr. Pierce would see that she was competent. Maybe, after months of humiliation and reassignment and public reprimand, the tide was finally changing. She would have 4 hours before she learned otherwise. She went home at 6:24 a.m. when her shift ended. Emma was still asleep, curled under her pink blanket, one foot sticking out into the cool air. Rachel showered. Dressed in fresh scrubs. Made coffee. At 7:41 a.m., she headed back to Cedar Creek Medical for her scheduled day shift, the shift she believed was the start of her redemption. Security stopped her at the staff entrance. Not unusual. Security usually nodded. This time, the guard checked his tablet, his expression shifting into something apologetic and awkward all at once. "Your access has been revoked," he said quietly. "You need to go directly to administration. They're expecting you." Rachel's jaw tightened once. Barely perceptible. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue. She simply turned and walked toward administration, her steps steady, her face showing nothing, the mask she'd perfected through every firefight, every loss, every moment in helm, and when showing emotion meant losing focus and losing focus meant people died. The administrative offices were the same sterile beige as everywhere else in Cedar Creek Medical. Same fluorescent lights. Same institutional smell of antiseptic and plastic. The receptionist told her to wait. She waited. At 7:13 a.m., a security escort appeared, not threatening, just present, and walked her to Dr. Pierce's office. He sat behind his desk like a man playing a part he'd perfected. His tie was already tied. His coffee was already cooling. He had the appearance of someone who'd been awake for hours, though Rachel suspected he'd just arrived. The termination letter sat in a manila folder on his desk, crisp and official, and waiting for her to arrive so he could perform this final humiliation. "Sit," he said, and Rachel sat because she was playing a part too. The temporary nurse. The woman nobody wanted. The invisible one. She sat and she folded her hands and she waited for him to deliver the conclusion he'd clearly been planning for weeks. "Your staffing agency has terminated your contract," he said, sliding the letter across his desk like a chef sliding a plate. Due to concerns about the accuracy of your employment history, we've also restricted your building access and reported your credentials to the medical board for formal investigation. He folded his hands on his desk, mirroring her posture, and smiled, the smile of a man who'd just removed a problem from his professional life. Your references are vague. Your work history has significant gaps. Your credentials simply don't verify cleanly. I've recommended full termination of your employment with Cedar Creek Medical. Rachel read the letter. Every word was precise. Every accusation was carefully worded to be technically true while being fundamentally dishonest. Irregularities in employment history, yes, because her real employment history had been classified and then erased by the United States Army. Credential concerns, yes, because her credentials belong to a woman who'd officially died in a training accident at Fort Benning in 2019. References that didn't verify, yes, because the officers who'd served with her were either deployed, dead, or still classified, their contact information buried under national security protocols. What irregularities? She asked. Her voice was level. Steady. Exactly what a temp nurse would sound like. Not what a captain with 70 combat missions would sound like. Not yet. Your resume shows significant gaps, Pierce said, and he was enjoying this now. She could see it in the way he leaned back in his chair. Your references are vague. Nobody really knows who you are or where you came from, Ms. Torres. That makes you a liability. To the hospital. To our patients. To me. He gestured toward the door. Clean out your locker. Security will ensure your departure is handled appropriately. You're done here. He handed her the letter as they walked out into the hallway. Day shift was arriving. Nurses in groups of 2 and 3, moving toward the break room for shift change, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the administrative kitchen. Pierce's voice carried across the corridor, loud enough to ensure witnesses, loud enough to ensure the message spread. Due to irregularities in her employment history, Miss Torres is no longer affiliated with Cedar Creek Medical. Thank you for your service. 2 nurses stopped mid-conversation. A third turned to stare. Rachel held the letter in her hands and didn't flinch. She didn't burn red. She didn't tremble. She simply stood there in her scrubs with her name badge still clipped to her pocket, accepting the public destruction of her temporary identity the same way she'd accepted every other blow. She walked to the locker room. The jacket with the faded unit patch sewn carefully into the lining, the last physical proof that she'd ever been anything other than a temp nurse, went into a canvas bag. The photograph of Emma went in next. Everything else could stay. She wasn't keeping anything else. Security walked her to the exit. The morning sun hit her face as she walked through the doors. Her car was in the staff parking lot, the same car she'd been driving for 3 years, paid off and unremarkable and waiting for her to take it home. At 8:11 a.m., she picked up Emma from before care at school. Her daughter looked up from her breakfast, confusion clear on her small face. Mommy, why are you home? It's morning. You work the evening shift. Rachel set down the canvas bag with her uniform and her photograph and her hidden past. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at her daughter's eyes, so open, so trusting, so completely unaware that the ground beneath their lives had just shifted again, and something inside her that had survived firefights and mortar rounds and isolation and humiliation finally cracked open like a dam. She put her head down on the kitchen table and she cried, her shoulders moving, her hands covering her face, the sound muffled against the wood but unmistakable. The sound of a woman who'd held herself together through impossible things and finally found the moment when holding on didn't matter anymore. Emma stood up from her cereal. She walked to her mother. She wrapped her small arms around Rachel's shoulders and said nothing, because she was 6 years old and children that age understand that some silences are deeper than words. 2 days felt like 2 years. Rachel sat in her apartment with a termination letter folded on the kitchen table, the edges already worn from her fingers opening and closing it, searching for words that might mean something different on a second reading. They never did. The letter cited irregularities in employment history with Dr. Pierce's signature at the bottom, his pen strokes sharp and deliberate as a surgeon's incision. Her daughter was at school. The apartment was silent except for the refrigerator's low hum and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Rachel had called in sick to her temp agency. They'd already filled her slot at Cedar Creek. Of course they had. Pierce had moved fast, the way predators do when they sense weakness. She wasn't weak. That was the problem. By late morning, Rachel's phone lit up with a news alert: Taliban commander granted medical asylum, transferred to Norfolk ICU under high security. She read it twice. The man's name meant nothing to her. His face in the thumbnail meant everything. She recognized the scar pattern on his jaw from a field report she'd read in 2019, the one that came with a classified stamp and a warning that certain prisoners were not to be discussed in official channels. What happened next pulled her toward Cedar Creek Medical before she'd fully decided to go. She needed her final paycheck from HR. That's what she told herself as she dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a grey hoodie, nothing that connected her to the hospital or the uniform she'd hung in the back of her closet for years ago. Her badge was deactivated. They'd made sure of that. She'd have to sign in as a visitor, surrender her dignity in small transactions, the way civilians do. The parking lot looked the same. The automatic doors still hissed open the same way. But the hallway felt different now, and narrower somehow, or maybe that was just the weight of leaving. Rachel moved past the main desk quickly, signed the visitor log with a name that technically wasn't hers anymore, and took the long route to HR through the ICU corridor. Muscle memory. Her feet knew these halls the way some people know their childhood homes. The ICU stretched before her in soft blues and greens, monitors beeping their mechanical heartbeat, the smell of antiseptic and something darker underneath, blood and infection, and the particular staleness of rooms where people fight death in 8-hour shifts. She passed room 306. Empty. Then 308. The curtain was drawn. She didn't look for room 312, where the ranger had been. Some histories were better left alone. Room 312 was occupied now. Not the ranger. Someone else. The glass door was reinforced, and 2 Marines in dress blue stood outside it like sentinels. Security for a high-value patient. Rachel almost walked past. Almost. The room's occupant lay motionless on the bed, his body barely creating shadows under the blanket. Yellow-tinged skin. The swollen abdomen of liver failure. Liver failure didn't happen overnight. This man had been sick for weeks, maybe months, hidden somewhere while someone negotiated his life in rooms Rachel would never enter, conversations she'd never hear. A former Taliban commander, the alert had said. Medical asylum. Diplomatic. She kept walking. The man's eyes moved. They tracked movement the way predator eyes do, locking onto hers through the window in that moment when her body was aligned with his sight line. His mouth opened. His chest heaved as if pulling the word up from somewhere deep and infected. Shaitan. The devil. The word came out in Pashto, thick and urgent, and Rachel felt her entire nervous system shift into a frequency she hadn't accessed in 4 years. The nurse adjusting his for turned, confused. The interpreter stationed in the corner froze mid-note. The word hung in the recycled hospital air like a detonation that no one else could quite hear. Rachel didn't stop. She kept walking. But her hands had gone white-knuckled around her bag strap, and her breathing had dropped to the shallow pattern that came before action, before survival. She was past the door. She was moving. She was. A gunnery sergeant stepped out from beside the room, his pressed uniform somehow more imposing than the sterile hospital backdrop. His name tape read Holloway. His eyes moved from the commander to Rachel with the careful calculation of someone trained to assess threats in fractions of seconds. Why would he call you that? Rachel turned. Her face showed nothing. 23 years of military training, for years of deliberately becoming someone small and apologetic, and now this. Now this man with his dress blues and his authority, asking questions that had only one true answer. I don't know, Rachel said. Holloway didn't look convinced. His jaw tightened. He was already reaching for his radio, his voice low as he stepped into the hallway, speaking in military shorthand that cut through the hospital sounds like a blade. Need to verify identity on the female civilian from the visitor log. Possible Helmand-related connection. Standing by for guidance. The response came back in static and authority. Holloway's face shifted as he listened. He looked at Rachel again, and something in his expression changed, recognition not of who she was, but of the fact that she wasn't who she was pretending to be. "I'll be here," he said to his radio. Then, to Rachel, "Don't go anywhere." But that wasn't a request. It was a command. Rachel stood in the hallway while Holloway made calls and received information through channels she could no longer access. She watched him pull up something on his phone, his eyes widening slightly as he read. She heard the word Pentagon spoken twice. She felt the hospital happening around her, nurses charting, monitors beeping, the hiss of a ventilator keeping someone's daughter alive in room 310, and underneath it all, the sound of her own heart rate climbing, the percussion of a body that hadn't forgotten how to prepare for combat, even when combat was the last thing she could afford. An hour passed. Or maybe 30 minutes. Time moved differently when you were waiting for your past to catch up with your present. Holloway held a file folder now, its edges marked with those security stamps that meant something in government buildings. His voice carried across the ICU corridor with the weight of official designation, and he was reading aloud, not to Rachel, but to the charge nurse, to anyone with ears to hear. Captain Rachel Torres. United States Army. Rachel's eyes closed for exactly 1 second. 75th Ranger Regiment. Helmand Province, 2017 to 2019. Two nurses who'd been charting looked up. One of them was Maria, who'd worked beside Rachel for 7 weeks and never learned her actual name. Maria's pen stopped moving. Silver Star recipient. 47 combat missions. Credited with saving 89 lives under direct enemy fire. That's when Dr. Pierce rounded the corner. He was walking fast, his expression shifting in real time, first confusion, then the dawning recognition that something had gone wrong, then fury, the kind of pure professional rage that comes when a carefully constructed lie begins to collapse. He took in the Marine, the file folder, the charge nurse's expression, and Rachel's stillness at the end of the hall like someone reading a sentence that only made sense backward. "What is this?" His voice was sharp, controlled anger held on a very short leash. "Who authorized this?" "That woman was terminated for cause. She's a civilian now. I don't care what kind of security clearance." Holloway didn't stop reading. Multiple citations for Valor. Conducted cross-border medical operations that saved coalition and enemy personnel. Built trust networks that fed intelligence to 3 joint task forces. Pierce's face had gone white. He stepped forward, attempting to interrupt, attempting to establish dominance in a space that was no longer his to dominate. "This is absurd. I have documentation that she falsified her credentials. I filed a complaint with the medical board. This woman has no." The elevator doors opened. A 2-star general in dress uniform stepped into the ICU corridor, flanked by 2 aides in dark suits. His shoulders carried the weight of decisions made in rooms with no windows, and his eyes scanned the hallway with the kind of comprehensive awareness that comes from seeing battlefields. His gaze landed on Rachel, and he walked directly toward her. He rendered a salute. The corridor went absolutely silent. Monitors beeping. The ventilator in room 310 cycling air into lungs that were no longer breathing on their own. But human sound, all of it stopped. Rachel's hands rose to return the salute, muscle memory overriding 4 years of civilian performance, her body remembering protocols that her mind had been forced to forget. "Captain Torres," the general said. His voice was formal, measured, the kind of voice that had issued orders that cost lives and saved them in equal measure. "You've been cleared to resume active status. Your record has been reinstated." One of the aides stepped forward, reading from a tablet with the practice monotone of government documentation. Multiple Silver Star citations. Specialist in forward surgical care under hostile conditions. Classified cross-border operations, Camp Lemonnier through FOB Shank. Psychological resilience evaluations, top 3%. Tactical medicine instructor certified through Naval Special Warfare Command. Pierce was backing toward his office now, his face the color of someone who'd just understood the magnitude of his mistake. There must be some error. This woman worked for my hospital. I have her employment file. She submitted. A Pentagon representative in a charcoal suit stepped forward, and his voice cut through Pierce's words like a scalpel through anesthetized tissue. Call sign, Reaper 6. The name hung in the air. Rachel's daughter had been 6 years old when that call sign stopped being used, when Captain Torres died in a training accident at Fort Benning, officially, paperwork-wise, in all the ways that mattered to governments that needed certain people to disappear. She was erased from official records following a classified operation in 2019, the representative continued. The cover story was distributed to all relevant agencies. Which means, Doctor, that when you filed a complaint with the medical board claiming she falsified her credentials, you triggered a federal investigation. Pierce's hand was on his office door frame now, his knuckles white. Into who was accessing classified personnel files, the representative said, and why? FBI agents are currently in your office reviewing your computer activity for the past 18 months. The silence that followed was the kind that only happened when the ground beneath someone's feet suddenly became quicksand. Rachel watched Pierce's face cycle through the stages of comprehension, the moment when he understood that his careful fabrications hadn't erased Rachel, they'd exposed him. The moment when he realized that every keystroke, every deleted file, every attempt to cover his tracks had been logged by an IT department that reported to federal law enforcement, not to hospital administrators. The documents you created to justify her termination, the representative continued, his tone never varying from that flat, official register, were traced to your desktop. The system also shows unauthorized access to patient billing codes, fraudulent charge entries, and documentation of payment arrangements with 3 separate medical supply companies totaling $470,000 over the past 16 months. Pierce's office door opened from the inside. 2 agents in dark windbreakers stood in the doorway, their expressions the kind that came from having conducted enough searches to know exactly what they'd find before they found it. Dr. Pierce, one of them said, we need you to come with us. Rachel stood at the end of the ICU corridor while the man who'd spent 7 weeks trying to erase her was led toward an elevator by federal agents. The general was shaking her hand, and his aide was presenting a folder marked with stamps that meant she was no longer invisible. The Marine Corps liaison was nodding, the expression on his face suggesting he'd known something like this was coming the moment the Taliban commander whispered that word in Pashto. In room 312, the patient who'd called her the devil lay in the ICU bed, his yellow eyes tracking movement in the hallway, his broken body the collateral damage of wars that had ended before they started. And in an office 2 floors down, FBI agents were photographing billing spreadsheets while Dr. Pierce sat in an interrogation room finally understanding that some people couldn't be rewritten out of existence. Some people were just waiting for the right moment to come home. The corridor fell silent as the Marine Corps liaison's voice carried through Cedar Creek Medical like a ceremonial bell tolling across still water. He stood outside room 312 with a classified file folder open in his hands, reading aloud to the assembled staff, his words cutting through the fluorescent hum with the precision of a scalpel. Captain Rachel Torres, United States Army, Silver Star recipient, 47 combat missions, credited with saving 89 lives under direct enemy fire. The file photograph showed a woman in desert fatigues, scarred hands gripping a trauma bag, eyes that had seen things no one in this hallway would ever comprehend. Dr. Pierce stood frozen 3 feet away, his face draining of color like someone watching his own life drain down a hospital sink. The same woman he had publicly humiliated, the same nurse he had systematically isolated, the same temp worker he had fired with a termination letter and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, was standing there with a silver star pinned to documentation that had been sealed in Pentagon archives for 4 years. The liaison continued, his voice steady and absolute. Classified cross-border operations, 2019. Officially deceased in a training accident at Fort Benning. Service record erased per JSOC protocols. He closed the folder. The room didn't just go silent. The silence became a physical presence, something you could feel pressing against your chest like a sandbag. Nurses who had cleared the break room when Rachel sat down now stared at the ground. The resident who had questioned her medical decision stood with his mouth slightly open. And Dr. Pierce looked like a man watching his entire career flash before his eyes in real time, frame by frame, understanding frame by frame that he had just attempted to destroy a decorated war hero because she was better at her job than he was. The hospital doors opened, and a 2-star general entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to air moving differently around him. His uniform carried decorations that required their own reference guide. He approached Rachel with the kind of respect usually reserved for monuments and rendered a salute, a formal, perfect, military salute, to a woman in hospital scrubs who hadn't worn rank insignia in 4 years. The general's voice was gravel and steel. "Welcome home, Captain Torres." Then the Pentagon representative stepped forward, a woman in a charcoal suit with the kind of composure that comes from delivering classified information in public hospitals on a Wednesday afternoon. She spoke clearly enough for the entire corridor to hear, each word a hammer driving a final nail. Your operational call sign was Reaper 6. You held the highest medical commendation rating in JSOC history. The Army is reinstating your rank, your security clearance, and offering you command of a new trauma medical training division. She paused, letting the weight settle. Effective immediately, you are no longer a temp nurse at Cedar Creek Medical. You are Captain Rachel Torres, and the United States Army wants you back. Dr. Pierce's jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle tremor from 10 feet away. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand moved toward his phone, then froze. Behind him, the doors to his office opened, and 2 FBI agents emerged carrying bankers' boxes stacked like evidence of a collapsing empire. One of them was reading something from a tablet, his voice calm and procedural. Dr. Marcus Pierce, you're under federal arrest for attempted identity fraud, falsification of medical records, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of the anti-kickback statute. The agent's voice had the weight of institutional authority, the kind of voice that doesn't raise volume because it doesn't need to. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Pierce's face flushed like someone had poured hot water under his skin. This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting hospital standards. That woman's credentials were questionable. I had legitimate concerns about. The agent cut him off with the efficiency of someone who had heard every excuse before and found them all inadequate. You attempted to forge medical credentials in Captain Torres's name to justify her termination. That's a federal crime. You submitted inflated billing codes for 47 ICU patients over an 18-month period, generating approximately $847,000 in fraudulent charges. You accepted kickbacks from Meridian Medical Supply totaling $156,000 in wire transfers to a private account registered to your wife. The agent held up the hard drive, smaller than a credit card, larger than a nightmare. Everything is on here. Every email. Every billing code. Every payment. Your desktop computer at 2:37 a.m. last Tuesday, uploading forged credentials to the hospital server. They walked him out in handcuffs, and the procession moved like a funeral for something that had been dead for months but nobody had buried yet. Past the break room where the staff used to leave their tables the moment Rachel sat down. Past the unit board where her fabricated reprimand still hung like monuments to a lie. Past room 312 where the Army Ranger stood in the window frame, still healing, still standing on legs Rachel had saved, watching Dr. Pierce shuffle past with federal agents on either side of him. The Ranger's expression didn't change. He had seen worse than this in Helmand Province. He had seen what courage looked like when it was being systematically destroyed by smaller, pettier hands. He had seen Captain Torres perform miracles under fire. Watching her be vindicated in a hospital corridor was almost anticlimactic. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded like a tumor that turns out to be larger on the skin than the surgeon initially believed. The CEO of Meridian Medical Supply was indicted on conspiracy charges. 3 other physicians who had participated in the billing scheme received suspensions and mandatory restitution. Cedar Creek Medical's board of directors held an emergency meeting and issued a formal apology to Captain Rachel Torres, offering her the position of Director of Trauma Services with a salary increase and the authority to restructure the entire medical training program. Rachel declined politely. She had received a call from Fort Benning 2 hours earlier. The Pentagon was reinstating her rank formally. They were offering her something better than director, they were offering her a command. A new training division. A chance to build something from nothing. A chance to ensure that no combat medic would ever have to hide who they were, would ever have to absorb humiliation from someone too small to see their actual value. 6 months later, Rachel stood in a classroom at Fort Benning teaching a new cohort of 14 combat medics the procedure that had saved the Ranger's life. Her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from having actually done the work, having held people's lungs in her hands while mortars fell around her. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You've trained this 1,000 times. When it's real, everything slows down. Your hands remember. Pain is data. Pressure is information. You move. A student's hand went up. Rachel nodded. How do you stay calm when everything is chaos? Rachel's answer was simple. You don't. You become something that doesn't require calm. You become the protocol. Through the classroom window, visible across the parade ground, a white van pulled into the prison work release lot. Dr. Pierce, in an orange vest and restraints, began unloading medical supply boxes with the same hands that had once signed fraudulent billing codes, the same hands that had orchestrated her destruction. Rachel didn't stop teaching. She didn't even pause. She simply continued the lesson, watching her students absorb the knowledge that would save lives her former antagonist would never see. One of the students asked, "Captain, how do you become someone like you?" Rachel finished pinning a 14-gauge angiocath demonstration onto the training mannequin. You choose the people you save over the people trying to stop you. You do your job when nobody's watching and when everyone is. You understand that your uniform means something before you ever put it on. She looked directly at the student. You become someone worth trusting. Everything else follows. The graduation ceremony took place on a cold November morning when the Georgia sky looked like brushed steel. The Ranger from room 312 stood in dress uniform with his right leg still slightly favoring the muscles Rachel had helped preserve, the 75th Regiment patch on his shoulder identical to the one Rachel had unpacked from her jacket lining and mounted in her new office. Her daughter sat in the front row, old enough now to understand why her mom had come home early that night, old enough to understand why she had gone back. The general pinned medals onto Rachel's uniform, decorations she hadn't been allowed to wear for 4 years, commendations for operations that officially never happened. Silver Star. Bronze Star. Purple Heart, twice over. Each one represented a choice to save someone when everything and everyone was telling you to run. In her office afterward, the mounted unit patch hung beside her daughter's drawing, a soldier holding a stethoscope, captioned in careful child's handwriting, "My mom saves people." Rachel's class of combat medics had graduated with honors, trained by someone who knew exactly what it cost to be both healer and warrior, trained by someone who had survived not just the battlefield but the harder war of being erased and forced to rebuild herself in silence. At the graduation reception, one of her new medics approached her with the kind of respect usually reserved for legends. "Captain Torres, what's the most important thing you learned?" Rachel considered this, holding her coffee in a hand that had held lives together on a dozen different continents. "The most important thing is this: there are always people trying to diminish you. Always. Your job is to be so good at what you do that their small hands can't reach you. And then, once you're safe, you teach everyone else to be the same. If you've watched this far, you already know who deserves your respect. Not the ones with titles or the ones who fit in. The ones who keep showing up. The ones who never let anyone else become invisible again." Subscribe for more stories of people you underestimated. Like this video if you want to see the ones who hit back hardest. Comment below, what would you have done differently? Because that's where the real conversations happen.